Picture this. It's 1954, and J.R.R. Tolkien sits behind a camera on some makeshift film set, pipe clenched between his teeth, furiously scribbling notes in the margins of his own script. There's no green screen, no motion capture technology, and definitely no multi-million-dollar budget. Just an Oxford professor with very strong opinions about how his life's work should be portrayed. Cut. That orc doesn't sound nearly mythic enough. And where's the linguistic consistency in his battle cry? Tolkien was famously skeptical. Scratch that, openly hostile toward film adaptations of his work. He once called a proposed script quite horrible and worried that Hollywood would cheapen his carefully crafted mythology. But here's a fascinating thought experiment. What if the man himself had taken the director's chair? What would the Lord of the Rings look like through Tolkien's own cinematic lens? The answer might surprise you, and it definitely wouldn't look anything like Peter Jackson's trilogy. Before we dive into our hypothetical Tolkien film, let's establish what the man actually thought about cinema. Spoiler alert, he wasn't a fan. In 1957, when film rights were first being discussed, Tolkien received a treatment from screenwriter Morton Grady Zimmerman that made him absolutely livid. His response letter is a masterclass in academic passive aggression. He called the script hasty, careless, and impertinent, and that was just the opening salvo. Tolkien's main grievances: the script oversimplified his characters, butchered his carefully constructed languages, and, perhaps most damning, treated his work like generic fantasy adventure rather than the mythological epic he'd spent decades crafting. He was particularly incensed by suggestions to make the story more cinematic by adding unnecessary action sequences and dumbing down the philosophical elements. But here's what's fascinating. Tolkien's criticisms weren't just about protecting his intellectual property. They revealed his deep understanding of what made his work special. He worried that film as a medium was fundamentally incompatible with the kind of storytelling he was doing. "I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations," he once wrote, and he extended this philosophy to film adaptation. He believed that movies would inevitably force symbolic interpretations onto his work, reducing his rich sub-creation to simple metaphors. More importantly, he thought cinema couldn't capture the linguistic beauty that was central to his vision. The weight of ancient words, the music of Elvish, the deep history embedded in every name and place. Tolkien saw his work as mythology in the truest sense, stories that felt ancient, timeless, and rooted in something deeper than entertainment. Hollywood, with its need for marketability and mass appeal, seemed like the antithesis of everything he was trying to achieve. Yet despite all this resistance, Tolkien did eventually sell the film rights. Why? Well, even Oxford professors need to pay the bills. But he maintained his skepticism right up until his death, never living to see how his fears about film adaptation would play out. So if Tolkien had somehow overcome his technological aversion and picked up a camera, what would his Middle-earth actually look like? First, forget everything you know about modern fantasy filmmaking. There would be no sweeping helicopter shots of vast armies clashing on Pelennor fields, no slow-motion hero moments, and definitely no Michael Bay-style explosion sequences. Tolkien's cinematic Middle-earth would be fundamentally different in both scale and focus. The man was obsessed with what he called sub-creation, the idea that fantasy should feel like a real, lived-in world with genuine history. His film would likely be much more intimate, focusing on the texture of this world rather than its spectacle. Imagine long, contemplative shots of the Shire's rolling hills, with Tolkien's camera lingering on the weathered doors of hobbit holes, the grain of well-worn wooden furniture, the play of light through ancient trees. Languages would take center stage in a way no Hollywood adaptation has ever attempted. We'd probably get extended sequences of characters speaking in full Elvish or Dwarvish, with subtitles that Tolkien himself had crafted. The camera would linger on characters' faces as they speak these ancient tongues, emphasizing the weight and music of the words, rather than rushing past them to get to the action. Where Peter Jackson gave us soaring shots of Edoras and Minas Tirith, Tolkien would likely focus on the small details that made these places feel real to him. The carved stones that tell of ancient kings, the worn paths that speak of countless feet, the way light falls differently in halls built by different peoples. His establishing shots wouldn't be about showing the scale of his world, but about conveying its age and depth. This extends to character portrayal as well. Jackson's films, brilliant as they are, often treat characters as archetypes: the brave king, the wise wizard, the loyal friend. Tolkien's versions would likely be far more complex and contradictory, allowing for long scenes of dialogue and moral contemplation. Think less action hero and more tragic mythic figure. The battle scenes, when they occurred at all, would be completely different. Tolkien was a World War I veteran who had seen real combat, and his writing reflects a deep ambivalence about violence and glory. His battles wouldn't be choreographed spectacles, but chaotic, muddy, tragic affairs that emphasized loss rather than triumph. This brings us to perhaps the most fundamental difference. Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings as mythology, not as entertainment. And that distinction would be absolutely crucial to understanding his hypothetical film. When Tolkien created Middle-earth, he wasn't trying to write the next great adventure novel. He was attempting something far more ambitious and, frankly, more difficult to adapt. He was trying to create a new mythology for England, complete with its own languages, histories, and cosmology. His approach was more akin to someone compiling the Arthurian legends or transcribing Beowulf than to someone writing a fantasy adventure. This mythological approach would permeate every aspect of Tolkien's film. Characters wouldn't speak in naturalistic dialogue, but in the formal, elevated language of epic poetry. The pacing wouldn't be driven by modern cinematic expectations, but by the rhythm of oral storytelling traditions. Scenes would unfold with the deliberate gravity of ritual rather than the urgency of entertainment. Think about how Tolkien actually wrote dialogue in the books. Characters speak in complete sentences, with formal grammar and elevated vocabulary. They reference history and mythology naturally, assuming their listeners share a common cultural background. They pause for songs and stories and philosophical discussions that modern audiences might find slow or pretentious. Tolkien's film would preserve all of this, creating something that would feel more like watching a Wagner opera than a Hollywood blockbuster. The visual language would be equally elevated, where modern fantasy films use quick cuts and dynamic camera movement to maintain energy. Tolkien would likely employ long, static shots that allow viewers to contemplate and absorb. His camera would move like the eye of someone reading an illuminated manuscript, carefully, reverently, with attention to detail rather than spectacle. But here's the uncomfortable question. Would audiences actually enjoy this approach? Tolkien's mythological film might be artistically pure and thematically consistent, but it would also be profoundly challenging to watch. It would demand patience, cultural literacy, and a willingness to engage with unfamiliar storytelling conventions. In other words, it would be everything that successful Hollywood adaptations typically aren't. This isn't necessarily a criticism of either approach. Jackson's films succeeded because they found a way to honor Tolkien's vision, while translating it into a cinematic language that modern audiences could embrace. Tolkien's own version might have been more faithful to his original intentions, but it also might have reached far fewer people. But here's where our thought experiment runs into a fascinating wall of irony. Could Tolkien, the man who distrusted technology and barely tolerated television, actually have made a film at all? The evidence suggests probably not. Tolkien was famously Luddite-ish, preferring his typewriter to newer writing technologies and maintaining a deep suspicion of anything that felt artificial or mechanized. He saw film as fundamentally unreal, a medium that created false images rather than allowing readers to create their own imaginative pictures. For someone who believed that the greatest power of literature was its ability to let readers participate in sub-creation, cinema would have felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for. More practically, Tolkien was a perfectionist who spent decades crafting and revising his work. The collaborative, deadline-driven nature of filmmaking would have been antithetical to his working style. He couldn't even finish the Silmarillion in his lifetime because he kept revising and expanding it. Imagine him trying to work with producers, actors, and studio executives who wanted to make changes for commercial reasons. The technical limitations of 1950s and 1960s cinema would have created additional problems. Tolkien's vision required vast landscapes, complex creatures, and supernatural effects that simply weren't possible with the technology available during his lifetime. He would have been forced to choose between compromising his vision or creating something that looked cheap and unconvincing. Perhaps most importantly, Tolkien seems to have instinctively understood that his particular kind of storytelling was perfectly suited to prose and imperfectly suited to film. Books allow for the kind of detailed world-building, linguistic complexity, and internal contemplation that made Middle-earth special. They let readers imagine at their own pace and fill in details with their own creative participation. Film, by its nature, makes these imaginative choices for the audience. In a way, Tolkien had already created the perfect adaptation of his own work, the books themselves. His direction was the careful prose that guided readers' imaginations. His cinematography was the vivid descriptions that painted pictures in readers' minds, and his soundtrack was the rhythm and music of his language. So what if Tolkien had directed The Lord of the Rings? The honest answer is that he probably would have created something beautiful, challenging, and completely uncommercial, a work of art that honored his mythological vision, but struggled to reach the massive audience that Peter Jackson's films eventually found. But here's the deeper truth. Tolkien did direct his own version of The Lord of the Rings. He did it not with cameras and actors, but with carefully chosen words and painstakingly constructed languages. He created a work that allows every reader to be their own director, imagining their own version of Middle-earth based on his detailed but never restrictive descriptions. The book is the ultimate director's cut, uncompromised, complete, and perfectly suited to its medium. Jackson's films, brilliant as they are necessarily just one interpretation of Tolkien's vision, filtered through the limitations and possibilities of cinema. Tolkien's own interpretation lives in the prose itself, waiting for each new reader to discover it. Maybe that's the real magic of The Lord of the Rings. It's not just a story, but a framework for infinite stories. Every reader brings their own imagination to Middle-earth, making it real in their own unique way. No film, no matter how faithful or well-crafted, can replicate that kind of personal creative participation. In the end, Tolkien didn't need to direct a film adaptation of his work. He had already created something better, a story so rich and detailed that it continues to live and grow in the imagination of everyone who reads it. That's a kind of direction that transcends any single medium, and perhaps that's exactly what he intended all along. What do you think? Which scene from The Lord of the Rings do you believe Tolkien would have filmed most differently from Peter Jackson's adaptation? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the professor himself might have brought his world to life on screen.